Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Israel Unplugged. This is Josh Wander from Yerushalayim. I'm joined by my co-host, Rabbi Moshe Lichtman from Beit Shemesh.
Hello, hello. Thank you for joining us today.
Where you get the unadulterated facts of where we're holding in the redemptive process, focusing primarily on the ingathering of the exile. Speaking of which, we have listeners right now listening in from the United States, from Israel. If you hear your country called, just start clapping. United States, Israel, Ukraine, Sweden, the United Kingdom, Australia, Morocco, France, and Brazil. So we have people from around the world tuning in as we speak, and we're so happy for you to join us. We have an exciting show planned for you. This is a live show, so you can call in. If you're in North America, you can call 301-768-4841 with your comments, with your questions. If you are fortunate enough to be in Eretz Israel, the number would be 02-650-0151. And we have an exciting show planned for you. We're going to discuss the upcoming fast of Asara B'Tevet, which is coming up this week. There's also another holiday which will not be mentioned, but we will mention it on the show. And there is a lot going on in the world. There is, right now, I can feel it in my bones, as the new corona strain has been released, that it's supposedly 70% more contagious than the first one. In fact, there was someone that came down with it in Bnei Brak, supposedly had both of them, and unfortunately passed away from the second one. The gates of Israel are closing. We know that there are plans to close the airport. Any Israeli that comes into the country has to go into a mandatory, compulsory 14-day quarantine in a hotel or wherever the government chooses to put them. And non-Israelis are going to be shut out completely. Those that are coming from the United Kingdom, for those listeners in the United Kingdom, there is going to be a lot of problems for people coming from the United Kingdom in specific. So beware, be careful, and stay tuned.
How did a nice Jewish girl from Delaware end up living in Israel? Shalom, I'm Natalie Sapinski. Join me on my show, Returning Home. Meet different people who have moved to Israel. Hear their personal stories, their highs, their lows, and everything in between. Each week, we talk to experts on immigration and the process of moving to Israel. Listen to Returning Home every Thursday, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Israel Unplugged. This is your co-host, Moshe Lichtman. And as promised, we're going to discuss a little bit about the upcoming fast day. You know, there are 4 or 5 fasts that commemorate the destruction of the temple. And chronologically speaking, the 10th of Tevet, which falls out this year on Friday, which is actually very unique. It's the only fast that can fall out on a Friday, and we actually fast on a Friday, which is very, very rare, because that means you have to go into the Sabbath feeling, very hungry and lowly.
And if it were to fall out on Shabbos, we would fast on Shabbos, but the calendar doesn't allow.
Exactly. It's one of those fasts that, besides, of course, Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur even falls out on the Shabbat. We fast. But of the fasts that were instituted later on by the prophets, the 10th of Tevet is the only one that it is such a strong fast, such a powerful fast, that we would theoretically even fast on the Sabbath. So anyway, why? What was so special or so terrible about the 10th of Tevet? Well, it really is the beginning of the destruction. It was the first thing that happened. It was when Nebuchadnezzar made a siege around Jerusalem, which eventually led to the destruction of the temple. And in fact, the 10th of Tevet is when it happened in the first temple period. The second temple was a different date altogether, but we still commemorate it because it's really the beginning of all of the troubles that happened afterwards in terms of the destruction of the temple. So let's talk a little bit about why the temple was destroyed, because we all hope and wish for the day that we will rebuild the temple. We'll go back to the days of old, and we will have a king, the messianic king, this descendant of David HaMelech, the King David, and we will have a temple and everything. But in order for that to happen, we have to rectify the sins that were caused because of which these things happened. So Josh, tell me, I'm sure you know this. Why do the rabbis say the first temple was destroyed? It's a Gemara, a passage in the Gemara in the Talmud on Yoma 9b. What were the sins for the first destruction?
Shvichas damim, which is
bloodshed, murder. Yeah,
which is murder. Avodah zara, which is idolatry.
Correct.
And Gilui Arayot, and adultery.
Adultery. Okay. And then, fine, that's pretty clear in the works of the prophets, because that's when it happened, right? It was during the first temple period, which is the time of the prophets. So, and it's clear that these sins were rampant amongst the Jewish people, and because of them, God destroyed the temple. But then we came back in the days of Ezra, who we'll get back to in a few minutes, and we rebuilt the temple 70 years later, after the beginning of the exile to Babylonia. We rebuilt the temple, and that stood for 420 years, in the midst of which, by the way, was the whole Hanukkah story, which we discussed last week, right? Around 200 years before the second destruction was the whole Hanukkah story, and we had sovereignty over our land for 200 years because of the Hasmonean revolt. But then eventually the temple was destroyed again. But why was the temple destroyed again? What does the Talmud say about that, Josh? I'm sure you know this one.
Tamar Yonah says, Sinat Chinam.
Correct. It was because of, how would you translate that? I've done it many times in my book, so I know. Actually, I forgot. Either unfounded or baseless hatred. In fact, the Gemara even says that they were big tzaddikim. They were tremendous. They really were righteous individuals in terms of doing Torah and mitzvot, learning. They learned all the time, and they did even acts of kindness, but they hated each other. There was a hatred, and there's a very famous piece by the Netziv of Volozhin, who he is the author of Ha-Mek Davar, one of the commentaries on the Bible. And he writes in his introduction to the book of Bereshit, he says that the problem was, because you think about it, like, what does that mean? They were doing all these good deeds, but they hated each other. Like, how could that be? The answer is they didn't hate each other like, because of jealousy or, the type of hatred that we think of. It was a religious hatred. It was because they thought that anybody who didn't agree with their brand of Judaism, with their understanding of what you would say in Yiddish, frumkeit, of religiosity, they said that those people were heretics, and they felt it was even a religious obligation to hate these other people because they weren't frum enough, they weren't religious enough.
And historically, there were different groups that were fighting each other. There were the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Essenes, and they were all fighting each other. And Josephus goes into this in much detail. And it led to, we know historically how it led to the destruction. We're not talking in a spiritual sense, but right. How they burnt down the food storage.
Silos, right.
Yeah, exactly. But this is eventually what led to historically to the destruction of the temple.
Correct. And so, let's put it this way. Number one, we have to rectify the sins, the major cardinal sins that cause the first destruction, which is idolatry. And of course, you'll say, "What do you mean? Who serves idols these days? No one practices idolatry anymore." To a certain degree, that's true, but there are certain things that we don't really honestly believe they're gods, but we spend so much of our lives worshiping, in a certain sense, that we spend so much of our time on these things. I don't want to go into detail because I don't want to get in trouble, right? But I think we can all think of things that we spend a little bit too much time on that is not, that it does not help, to put it very lightly, does not help our service of God. And
running after the physical, running after money, running after the bigger, the nicer car and the bigger house, and keeping up with the Joneses. And even on a religious aspect of that, I would say that there's a lot of, unfortunately, there's so much that has creeped into our religion, which is problematic when it comes to idolatry. It may not be real idolatry, it may or may not be, but there's a lot of that. I live in a cemetery, and when I see around me, so I see lots of people coming to pray, and this has become more and more of a fad, I think, over the years, that people go what I call grave hopping. They go to different graves and they visit the Kivrei Tzadikim, which is brought down in a number of places that such a thing has been done historically. But when it comes to the point of actually praying to the people that are in the ground, that is definitely a very serious transgression, and that's something that unfortunately a lot of people make a mistake when they do it.
Right. You should just mention, people out there don't all know where you live. When you say you live in a cemetery, that doesn't sound very good. Why don't you explain to everybody out there what you mean?
So I think all our loyal listeners already know, but I live on the Mount of Olives, which is directly across from the Holy of Holies, the Temple Mountain, and that is what irks me even more, because when I see people praying to a grave instead of praying to the place where we believe that all prayers in the world go to before they go up to the heavens, they're standing directly in front of the holiest place in the world where they can pray to God Himself, and they choose to pray to a grave. That always bothers me. But okay.
And they often turn their backs to the Holy of Holies in order to pray to the grave. Okay, so there's idolatry. There's adultery, or any sexual sins. That is something that certainly we have to work on, and that doesn't only mean the actual sin, but anything even related to it. Let's not even go further, because that's not the purpose of this show. And of course, is murder, and not many people out there are murderers, but sometimes you can kill a person's character
or by shaming them.
Shaming them, exactly, which is a very bad thing. But I want to get back to the one that's really more relevant for us, and that is sinat chinam, the hatred, the baseless hatred that Jews have for each other from a religious perspective. They think that it's a mitzvah, that it is a good thing to hate certain people because they're not exactly as religious as I am, and that is something that unfortunately we know still exists in our day. But you sort of mentioned it before, but I want to point out something which a lot of people don't know. The parallel Gemara in the Yerushalmi, there's a Babylonian Talmud and there's a Jerusalem Talmud, which is written around the same time.
But not in Jerusalem.
Well, okay, yeah, in Tiberia, right? And up in Tiberias. But anyway, there, when the Gemara asks the same question, why was the second temple destroyed? So besides saying that it was because of baseless hatred, and that they do say, but they also say it was because, do you know, Josh? A love of money. It says it was because of a love of money and baseless hatred. And that is something that I think we all have to worry about. And this gets to the real topic of our show. The fact that there are so many Jews out there that still remain in the galut, in the exile, when we have our land back. And for a lot of them, the reason is because they don't want to part with their possessions and with their comfort. And that is one of the reasons the temple was destroyed, because they loved the money too much. They put too much emphasis on the material. And that is something that we definitely have to work on. And we will continue discussing this after the break, which will start in just a few moments.
Shalom, everybody. Making a difference often takes just one moment and one person at a time. I am Orly Benny Davis, your show host on Israel News Talk Radios from Jerusalem with Love. You'll be hearing people talking about politics, religion, social issues, and making a better tomorrow. Join me, Orly Benny Davis, for God and Country. From Jerusalem with Love.
Wednesdays on Israel News Talk Radio.
Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Did you know this psalm and many others were composed by a Jewish shepherd and musician who later became a king? Would you like to know some of the inner meanings of psalms to help you connect with God and strengthen your soul? An exciting and easy-to-read book is now available which will help you do just that. Software for the Soul, Psalms for Everyone, available on Kindle, Audible, and Amazon.com. Software for the Soul.
So those that are still with us on the show and listening to us and the wise words of Rabbi Moshe Lichtman regarding the upcoming fast of Asara B'Tevet want to know what the sequel of this is. What does it all mean? So please tell us, Rabbi Moshe, what this all means.
Yes. So, besides the obvious reason why we mourn, which again is already written in the Bible, in the Tanakh, and these fasts have the status of a very, very serious halakha, because they were instituted by the prophets. So, but besides that, there are also three other events, let's put it that way, that are commemorated on the 10th of Tevet. First of all, because there are events that happened not exactly on the 10th of Tevet, but right around the 10th of Tevet. The first one was that on the 9th of Tevet is the day that Ezra the Scribe died. Okay, who was Ezra the Scribe? Right, he was the one who, there's a book in the Bible written by him, Ezra and Nehemiah, and he actually was the leader of the Jewish people, came back from the Babylonian exile, and he died on the 9th of Tevet. And besides that, on the 8th of Tevet was when the Bible was translated into Greek, right? It's known as the Septuagint, right? The rabbis were forced to translate the Torah into Greek. And that happened on the 8th of Tevet. And the rabbis say that on that day, darkness came to the world, and it was for 3 days. So it really was the 8th, 9th, and 10th. So the 10th was even part of that. And in addition, the third thing is that the chief rabbinate set the day of the 10th of Tevet as a day of general mourning over it's called the Yom HaKaddish HaKlali, which is for those holy martyrs of the Holocaust, of Jews who were killed in the Holocaust, whose date of death is unknown. So you don't know when they exactly died. So everyone would say a Kaddish, the mourner's prayer, on the 10th of Tevet. So what is this all about? I don't know if you know this even, Josh, but besides many of the books that I translated, which I know you know well, there's one other book that I translated that is unknown, and that is one of the works of Rabbi Eliezer Melamed. Right, he wrote books called Pninei Halacha. He is a prolific author and tremendous Torah scholar, and even posek, halachic decisor. And he has a series of books called Penine Halacha, and many of them have been translated into various different languages. And I had the privilege of translating the one called Zmanim, which is about minor holidays, that's the way I would put it, into English. And this is where he discusses these different holidays. The holidays and the fast days are all in that book. And also, by the way, Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim, which is why I like the book a lot. There's a beautiful piece on Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim. So he says that Ezra the Sofer, which the rabbis actually say clearly was second to Moshe Rabbeinu. Had the Torah not been given to Moshe, it would have been given to Ezra. That's how great he was. And he was actually like a link between the Torah Shebaal Peh and the Torah Shebechtav. Some say that Ezra, I don't know if you know this, was Malachi, the prophet Malachi, one of the last prophets of Israel, was really the same as Ezra. It was the same person, just a different name. So he was really that link between Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral law, and the Torah Shebechtav, the written law. Okay. And then the Greeks came to power. We know that was the Hanukkah story, which we discussed last week. And they wanted the Torah translated into Greek. So what's so terrible about that, you'll say? Look at Art Scroll, all these beautiful translations of Tanakh and of the Gemara and everything. Why is that bad to translate the Tanakh, the Bible, into a different language?
In fact, we know that Greek is the only language that a Sefer Torah can be written in and still be kosher.
Right,
and
exactly.
It's considered a holy language in some ways.
To some degree, correct. But it was a calamity. The way Rav Malamed puts it is because the Torah belongs to the Jewish people. And translating it into Greek blurred the uniqueness of the Torah to specifically the Jewish people, because it gave the impression that anyone can engage in it. Anyone could have the Torah. Why not? Look, it's in English and it's in Greek and it's in all these different languages. Anybody can have it. And it takes away the uniqueness of Torah belonging specifically to the Jewish people. So I just want to read this one last paragraph. That Rav Malamed is a student of Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, who was a son of course, the great. He himself was great, but he was the son of his father, the great Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, the first chief rabbi of Israel, modern Israel. So he said in the name of his rabbi Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook that we must, on the day of Asara B'Tevet, we must rectify these three issues of the 10th of Tevet. Number one, in response to the siege of Jerusalem, we must strengthen the walls of the city and build up the land both spiritually and physically. Because again, the real reason we fast is because it was the day that the city of Jerusalem was besieged, and it eventually led to the destruction. So we have to fix that, and we have to rebuild the land both spiritually and physically. Number two, in response to the death of Ezra, we must enhance and glorify the Torah. Right, because we said he was really this person who was the link between the Torah Shebechtav, because he lived in that time period where we were switching over. There was no longer any more Tanakh, right? The Tanakh was closed, and he moved over into the oral law. So we have to strengthen, and we must enhance and glorify the Torah while engaging in the ingathering of the exiles, as Ezra the Scribe did. Because another thing about Ezra, of course, is that he is the one who brought the Jews back to Eretz Yisrael, to the land of Israel, in the time of the Second Temple. Although we already have discussed many times that so many Jews refused to listen to him. Remember when we were discussing the book Me'afar Kumi that I translated, Rise from the Dust by Tzvi Glat. So he has a whole section there where different communities throughout the world have traditions of letters that they got from Ezra Sofer begging them to come back to Israel and to help rebuild the Second Temple, and how these communities said, no, thanks, we'll stay in our little Jerusalem. You can have your big Jerusalem, the great Jerusalem, right? And because of that, Ezra cursed them, and they have to this day cursed, they feel that curse stayed with them throughout the exile. So Ezra was all about the ingathering of the exiles also, and therefore we have to try to rectify that. And that's really the point of our show, to make Jews realize that we belong in the land of Israel. And finally, in response to the translation of the Torah into Greek, we must restore our genuine Jewish spirit and culture and uproot all the evil spirits that entered our culture throughout the exile when the nations ruled over us. So that brings us to, I think, a very important thing that you said at the beginning, Josh, that Friday, which is the 10th of Tevet, happens to also fall out on a different date in a secular calendar. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Well, if you're Jewish and you're not living in Israel, wherever you may be, whether it be in the United States or France or England, Australia, chances are that if you're walking around this time of the year and if you walk into any store or mall, assuming that Corona rules allow that wherever you are, then chances are you're going to be filled with the music of the season, of the holiday season. And that season has nothing to do with Asara B'Tevet directly.
Or
in fact,
Hanukkah.
If you didn't have a little calendar set aside in your house or in your shul, in your synagogue, chances are you would not even know that there's Hanukkah or the 10th of Tevet that is coming up, because you are inundated with this holiday spirit. And that is a very, very sad state of affairs for Jews. One of the few things that Jews that come back home and move on Aliyah back to their homeland, they recognize right away for them, and especially for their children, is the educational experience it is to live in the land and to be surrounded with the spirit of the holidays here. And that's regardless of how religious you are or irreligious you are, whether you follow the holidays or you're not. It's hard not to go into any store, into any place, and to feel the holiday spirit, but the Jewish holiday spirit wherever you go. You go into a regular supermarket and you will see it around the holidays filled with whatever paraphernalia is needed for that specific holiday. And for the most part, you can go by December 25th here and not even know that it's a date on the calendar. Maybe less so where if you're around the old city and where I live, but in general around Israel, you would barely feel it. So it's something that really one has to think about when they think about Aliyah, is the fact that your children are going to have a calendar which is a Jewish calendar, and every holiday, everything they learn in school and everywhere they go outside, they're going to be surrounded with the Jewish holiday spirits instead of the non-Jewish ones, and that has a very serious impact on us emotionally, but it also has a very serious impact on us spiritually. And it's something that for us that grew up in America or grew up in countries abroad, it's something that we still have trouble dealing with today. That our whole childhood, we grew up with this, and it's part of us, and we're trying to get rid of it. And God willing, our children won't have the same difficulties that we do. Stay tuned, and we're going to continue this conversation soon.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
This is Shai Ben-Tekoa, and each week I'll be webcasting to you from Judea, origin of the word Jew, a people besieged and beleaguered in every generation. Nazi Germany's but a memory, but in its place the world invented the phantom Palestinians as this generation's internationally authorized Jew killers. Tune in for a different slant on life in Israel, Phantom Nation, every Monday.
Hi, I'm Rabbi David Aaron. The soul basics are the most profound, the most essential, and yet often the most neglected in our education. Join me for Soul Talk on Israel's News Talk Radio and discover the secrets to love, spiritual growth, and personal power.
Oh, hello. Okay, welcome back to Israel Unplugged. So right before the break, we were talking about the other holiday that is on this coming Friday. By the way, the only reason I know about this holiday, I'm being facetious here, of course, because I did grow up in America, and yes, it's throughout the air. You just being there, you breathe it in, so you know it. But it happens to be that my father, Alav Shalom, his birthday was December 25th, and my father-in-law also has the same birthday, December 25th. So we used to joke about that. You know, there's 3 important people born on December 25th. Anyway, so we were talking about how, you know,
who's the third? I'm joking.
Yeah, good question. Anyway, so it always reminds me of a Gemara, of a Talmudic statement that the rabbis make in, if I'm not mistaken, Avodah Zarah, page 8b or 8a, I'm not really sure, which says that Yisrael shebechutz la'aretz, Jews living in the diaspora, Ovdei avodah zara b'tahara hem. They are idolaters. We talked about idolatry before. B'tahara, in purity. What does that mean? How could you be an idolater? How could you serve other gods purely? What does that mean? So the explanation, Rashi says it, and it's clear, is that they don't do it on purpose. They don't mean to serve other gods. But the very presence in the lands of exile, it lends itself to serving other gods. Again, like we talked about before, it doesn't mean literally bowing down to other gods. But there's something about the atmosphere there that is more goyish. Let's put it that way. That is more, you know, Gentile leaning, let's put it that way. So here you have a perfect example. I mean, you have Jews who celebrate to a certain degree. They go, oh, great, you know, there's great deals on December 25th, you know, before it, you know, and everything in the stores is all talks about and you know, is surrounding the upcoming holiday.
Black Friday holiday.
Black Friday and all these different, right, exactly. So it's something that's in your blood, and it's not because you're doing it on purpose. It's ovdei avodah zarah, but b'tahara. And that actually brings me to a very powerful and beautiful idea from the parsha. So we know in this week's parsha, we have the reunion of Joseph with his father. Joseph finally reveals himself to the brothers, and he quickly says, "Go and, you know, bring a father down to Egypt because of the terrible famine that's everywhere else in the world." So it says that Yosef went out to greet his father when he heard he was coming. So he went out to greet him. And it says, "Vayipol al tzavarav vayevken." He fell on his neck and he wept, which is very strange. It should have said they wept, right? Both Yaakov and Yosef missed each other. It should have said they both wept. So why does it say only that he wept, and which is the he? So the rabbis, and Rashi quotes, it says that it was actually Yosef who was the one who was weeping, but Yaakov was not weeping. He did not fall on Yosef's neck, and he was not, nor did he kiss him or weep. Why? Why was that? What was Yaakov doing? So the rabbis say he was reciting the Shema. You know, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. That's what he was saying, which is so strange if you really think about it. I mean, he couldn't have said it before, couldn't have said it afterwards. He finally, after 22 years, is reunited with his long-lost, beloved son, and all he can do is say Kriyat Shema. He can't give a little bit of, you know, hugging his son and crying over him, finally seeing him. It's very, 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 very difficult to understand. Sorry.
By the way, there's a modern-day hero that is very similar, not similar in some ways, a descendant of Jacob, named Eli Beer, who founded the movement, the emergency services movement of United Hatzalah here in Israel. And
Right.
when he came out of 3 months being in a intensive care ward in Corona in Miami, and was finally, he didn't think he was going to make it out. He was on machines. He was being kept alive by just machines for weeks on end.
Right.
And they didn't think he was going to make it. And when he came back and he flew to Israel, the first thing he did when he saw his family was to say Shema. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So the rabbis, the commentators ask, what was Yaakov doing? So the Michtav Me'Eliyahu says something profound. He says that first he quotes the Sfat Emet, which is one of the Gerer Rebbes of the Hasidic Ger movement, and he says that you want to know why Yaakov did not give in to his emotions and kiss and hug his son, because he was afraid for his soul, that his love for Yosef might cause him to forget his love for the Creator. Therefore, he clung to God before meeting Yosef, thus repressing his love for material things, so much so that he was left with no possibility of showing his love to Yosef. But asks the Michtav Meliyahu, Rabbi Eliyahu Dessler, like, what? Really? I mean, we know that a person is allowed to enjoy life. You're supposed to enjoy life. This was such a beautiful reunion. Why wouldn't why wouldn't Yaakov do that? Why wouldn't he let himself a little bit of pleasure? And again, it's not even talking about physical pleasure. We're talking about an emotional pleasure. Why wouldn't he let himself do this? So listen to what Rabbi Eliyahu Dessler answers. He says, indeed, Yaakov Avinu acted in this manner, meaning he enjoyed life, which you're allowed to do and you're even supposed to do, only in Eretz Yisrael, only in the holy place. Egypt, however, was different. And he no longer wanted to involve himself in any form of this worldly pleasure. Rather, he channeled it all heavenward through his love of God, because he was afraid of the influence that the defiled Egypt might have on him. You understand? Of course, Yaakov Avinu understood that there's nothing wrong with enjoying life, and especially these deep emotional connections that you have with people, with your family members. And that's what he would do all the time in the land of Israel, where the Jewish people belong. But once he left the land of Israel, he felt that he could not let himself enjoy this, because there are so many outside influences that might affect him and might make it a little bit tainted, and therefore he didn't do it. And that's what we're talking about here, the fact that, just the atmosphere around outside the land of Israel is an unholy atmosphere for the Jew, and we all belong here in Eretz Yisrael, where we can enjoy life, and there's nothing wrong with doing that here in the Holy Land. Josh, you wanted to share something also.
Yeah, I spoke this past week at the Kiddush that we had in the Old City of Jerusalem here about the reunion of, these are some of my favorite Torah portions, by the way, the reunion, it happens to be my Hebrew name is Yaakov Yosef, so I have a special connection to it. And I spoke about this idea of the reunion of the brothers and Yosef. And according to the teachings of the Ramban Nachmanides, very interesting things going on. The brothers were given a job to figure out the mistake they made with selling Joseph in the first place. And Yosef arranged this whole reunion, the whole setup, in order to get them to realize that there's something going on here, that they have to wake up and understand their mistake. And he keeps hinting to them, and he keeps showing them things which should be obvious to anyone looking, that he is indeed the ruler of the land. In fact, we know from the Medrash that the brothers came in through all different gates in Egypt looking for his brother, looking for him. They were looking for Yosef, but they were looking in the wrong places. They were looking in the slave market. They would never suspected that he would be king or second to the king. So at the point that he's giving them opportunity after opportunity, and that is their nisayon, that is their test to see whether they're going to recognize that he is indeed Yosef, because the idea was that they were supposed to come to a level of recognition where they would say, Ata Yosef, you're Yosef, you're our brother. But they couldn't get to it. And instead, in this week's parasha, in this week's Torah portion, we see that instead it came to a point where there was no time left. And there was no time for them to delay any further. And he had to burst out and say, Ani Yosef, I am Yosef. And they actually failed at their mission in recognizing it themselves. And that's what the Gra says, V'yaker Yosef es echo v'hem lo hikiru, that Yosef recognized his brothers, but they didn't recognize him. He explains that in the times of the Geula and Kol HaTorah, he says in the times of the redemption is going to be happening all around us, and people are going to be oblivious. That is the job that we have today. We have an idea of a Mashiach ben Yosef, the idea that there is a process, not only a person, but there's a process of Mashiach, of the redemption, and we are supposed to come to that recognition of understanding that the redemption is happening all around us. We are supposed to make that move of coming back to Eretz Yisrael, of making the redemption, of being doing concrete actions in order to make the redemption happen. And if we don't come to that, there is a point of time which will come where it's going to be too late, and Yosef will be revealed. Ani Yosef, it's going to be too late. If those that don't recognize it themselves, it will be forced upon them. And that's also the idea of the plagues that we had up until the plague of darkness, where a lot of Jews didn't realize it and they were lost. And it came to the last plague of Makat Bechorot, of the killing of the firstborn, for everybody to understand what was going on. And at that point, it was already too late. And I believe that maybe we can compare that to the corona of today, where people, unfortunately, around the world are going through this disastrous pandemic. And this is the point where we have to come finally to the final recognition, or else. Thank you for joining with us. It was a pleasure.
We'll see you next week.
Next week.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. Just click the orange button at the top of the IsraelNewsTalkRadio.home page, log in as yourself or an anonymous guest, and join in on the fun. You'll meet other listeners from all over the world who listen to Israel News Talk Radio, and you can make new friends. Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. It's the closest you can get to being in the studio with us.
We love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.